Hello and welcome to Realpolitik Confidential Episode 9. Today it is the 28th of June 2025 and I am your host Alex Crișan. Today we shall discuss China. The title of Episode 9 is, after all, The Two Chinas, Reunification, Invasion, or called Containment. There are moments in history when geography becomes destiny, and none more so than the 180 kilometers of ocean separating Taiwan from mainland China. It's not just a strait, it's a trench, a frontier between authoritarian ambition and democratic resilience. And in 2025, it is perhaps the most dangerous place on Earth. But first, let's discuss a tiny bit of history. On January 12, 1950, the US Secretary of State Dean Acheson delivered a speech that changed history forever. Not because of what he said, but because of what he left out. He laid out America's defense perimeter in Asia and didn't mention South Korea. What was the outcome? Well, 6 months later, North Korean tanks rolled across the 38th parallel. I would like to read to you a few excerpts out of this famous speech. It goes something like this. This afternoon I should like to discuss with you the relations between the people of the United States and the people of Asia. What is the situation in regard to the military security of the Pacific area, and what is our policy in regard to it? In the first place, the defeat and the disarmament of Japan has placed upon the United States the necessity of assuming military defenses of Japan so long as that is required, both in the interest of our security and in the interest of the security of the entire Pacific area, and, in all honor, in the interest of Japanese security. We have American and there are Australian troops in Japan. I'm not in a position to speak for the Australians, but I can assure you that there is no intention of any sort of abandoning or weakening the defenses of Japan, and that, whatever arrangements are to be made, either through permanent settlement or otherwise, that defenses must and shall be maintained. This defensive perimeter runs along the Aleutians to Japan and then goes to the Ryukyus. We hold important defense positions in the Ryukyu Island, and we will continue to hold. In the interest of the population of Ryukyu Islands, we will, at an appropriate time, offer to hold these islands under the trusteeship of the United Nations. But they are essential parts of the defensive perimeter of the Pacific, and they must and will be held. The defensive perimeter runs through the Ryukyus to the Philippine Islands. Our defensive relations with the Philippines are contained in agreements between us. Those agreements are being loyally carried out and will be loyally carried out. As you might have noticed, no mention of Korea whatsoever. No mention of Vietnam either. So, what we ended up with was a power vacuum in Asia. And we all know how that turned out. But now let's get back to China. As I said earlier, only 180 kilometers of ocean, the Taiwan Strait, separates China from a vibrant democracy. In 2025, this narrow waterway is arguably the world's most dangerous flashpoint. Beijing insists reunification is a historic inevitability, tying the mission to its 2049 China Dream Centenary. Western analysts caution, however, that Taiwan is not Ukraine. Taiwan is not Ukraine because the island is considered part of China. China's leaders, nonetheless, seem emboldened by a rare strategic window, with the United States focused on midterm elections and new conflicts in the Middle East and beyond. Taiwan is also politically divided, which also emboldens them. Beijing might calculate that the time is right now, and that they should act immediately. the pressing question isn't if China will move on Taiwan, but how it might do so, and whether democracies around the world are ready to respond. Today, the omission would be different if Atkinson would hold yet another speech. Today the question isn't what gets said, it's what we're all afraid to say. Will America fight for Taiwan? Because these 180 kilometers of ocean, barely the length of a decent highway, not that I would know as a Romanian, separates one of the world's most advanced democracies from its most powerful authoritarian rival. And that stretch of water, the Taiwan Strait, is no longer a buffer but a fuse. This episode is not a prediction, it's a warning. You see, the Chinese Communist Party has a date circled on the wall, and that date is 2049, the 100-year anniversary of the People's Republic of China. Xi Jinping calls it a national rejuvenation. What he means is unification. And Taiwan, flawed, defiant, democratic. Taiwan. That is the prize. The prize that completes the map of China. Now they'll tell you reunification is inevitable, that it's just a matter of time, that the West is distracted, divided and tired, that the Chinese dragon has finally awakened. But, inevitability is most certainly a myth. After all, history is not a conveyor belt, it's a knife's edge. And somewhere between Beijing's ambition and Washington's hesitation, the blade is starting to shimmer in the sunlight. There is a window, starting from 2025 to 2027. It's not really speculation, it's strategy. Xi has ordered the PLA to be ready for the Taiwan option by 2027. Why? Well, because it's a moment of opportunity. The United States would be tangled in election cycles and crises. Europe is focused on Ukraine and on energy issues. And Taiwan is changing leadership. Caught between defiance and fear, conscription and fatigue, all of these amount for the perfect storm in the South China Sea. And, as I said earlier, the question isn't if China moves, it's how. Do they choke the island with a blockade? Do they rain missiles on its infrastructure? Or do they go all in with boots, bullets and blood on the ground? And if they do, if Beijing crosses the line, what happens next? Will the United States honor its unspoken red line? Will Japan, Australia and the Philippines respond? Will the world remember that 90% of advanced microchips are made in Taiwan? Or will we simply watch as our supply chains crash and call it fate? Because this isn't just about a flag or a piece of land. Taiwan is a litmus test for power, for democracy, for the idea that small nations don't have to kneel when big ones threaten. If Taiwan falls without resistance, it won't just be another fall. And it won't fall alone. It will drag with it in its grand finale the illusion of a free global order. And in the silence that follows, authoritarianism will learn that it doesn't have to ask for permission. So buckle in, because in today's episode we will dissect the anatomy of a crisis, from Beijing's war plans to Taiwan's brittle defenses, to the world's last great semiconductor chokehold. And remember, this is where it all happens. Once again, welcome to Realpolitik Confidential. I am Alex Crișan and this segment is called The Tripwire of the Century. Let's start with what China actually wants. Forget the headlines, forget the think tank panels, and let's strip away the rhetoric. What remains is this: Reunification with Taiwan is not an aspiration, it is a mandate. Since taking power, Xi Jinping has tethered the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party to a singular narrative, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And the rejuvenation, or fuxing as they call it, means restoring what was lost: sovereignty, territory, and pride. Taiwan is not a side issue, it is the unfinished business of the Chinese Civil War, and the closing chapter of what Xi sees as a century of national humiliation. Officially, Xi doesn't name a deadline, but unofficially, there's no room for doubt. 2049, the 100 years anniversary of the People's Republic of China. The year China must stand tall among nations, whole and undivided. And if you're paying attention, the clock isn't ticking towards 2049. It's ticking towards 2027. Why 2027? Well, because that's the year she reportedly ordered the People's Liberation Army to be fully capable of taking Taiwan by force. Not necessarily to invade, but to be ready to do so. And if you know anything about Chinese strategy, you know readiness isn't rhetoric, it's intent, wearing uniform. So what does the readiness look like? Well, let's break it down. First we have Xi's China dream and the 2049 timeline. President Xi Jinping has set 2-century goals culminating in 2049, the 100-year anniversary of the PRC, and the era of quote-unquote national rejuvenation. Unification of Taiwan has become a core part of that vision. While Xi never explicitly used the word deadline, observers note that he has framed reunification as an indispensable task of the century. Indeed, 2027 as a date has become an informal benchmark. United States intelligence reported Xi wants the PLA ready to seize Taiwan by 2027. Indeed, much earlier than the earlier target of 2035. This acceleration fits a pattern. China's multi-decade plan sets intermediate goals. For example, they set themselves for a fully modern army by 2035. And they do so in order to achieve its ultimate objectives by 2049. Military modernization is well underway. Beijing's armed forces have undergone rapid upgrades. The PLA Navy, for example, now fields 2 full-size carriers, the Liaoning and the Shandong, and has launched a third, the Fujian, with a 4th Type 004 supercarrier, likely a nuclear-powered one, already under construction. This is what China's modernization looks like. And in order to put things far more into perspective, we also need to mention that China has also debuted large amphibious assault ships and is building hundreds of combatants and submarines. One report estimates over 370 battle force ships today, including the 140 plus warships and subs, with projections going up to 435 battle force ships by 2030. On land, the People's Liberation Army rocket force boasts a vast arsenal of advanced missiles. It deploys anti-ship ballistic missiles that can strike carriers at long range and even switch between conventional and nuclear warheads. China is also among the world's leaders in hypersonic weapons. Its DF-70 glide vehicles can evade defenses. In short, by the mid-2020s, China has built up the firepower needed to threaten Taiwan and US bases across the first island chain. The first island chain being the line of islands from Japan down through the Philippines. Now, We also need to discuss the quote-unquote peaceful reunification narrative. And we also need to take into account the fact that this narrative is fading. After all, we need to take into account the fact that the one country, two systems narrative of the People's Republic of China was the peaceful approach. But today's Beijing rhetoric has hardened. In the early 2024, the government dropped all mention of peaceful reunification in its public reports. Instead, Chinese media and officials now stress the inevitability of unification and threaten severe measures if Taiwan formalizes independence. This shift signals that Beijing may no longer be restrained by old diplomatic niceties and is more willing to use force if it deems it necessary. So why the 2025-2027 time period? Well, first of all, this is a prime window. Several factors converge to make the mid-2020s a tempting period for China. First, we have the US election cycle, which would be well underway, and transition to domestic politics could distract Washington big time. Second, the world is grappling with multiple crises. We have the Ukraine war, we have the Middle East conflicts, and we have the economic strains of a global economy which is far more fragmented than we believed. So, talking about fragmentation, this would fragment global attention. Third, Taiwan itself is politically split. Finally, China's own modernization milestones, as noted above, are now in place. In this context, 2025 to 2027 resembles a strategic window. One expert even warned China might accelerate actions towards Taiwan if US forces are tied up elsewhere. Thus, Beijing faces a calculated choice: act soon while conditions are favorable, or wait and risk different dynamics later. After all, over the past decade, the People's Liberation Army Navy has transformed from a coastal defense force into the world's largest naval fleet. I cannot stress this enough. The People's Liberation Army Navy has the world's largest naval fleet. Not the most powerful, but the biggest. You have the three aircraft carriers, previously mentioned, the Liaoning, the Shandong, and the New Fujian. You have massive amphibious assault ships, the famous Type 075s and 076s, who are not designed for show but for landing thousands of troops on foreign shores. And they're not done. The next carrier, which is likely to be nuclear powered, is already well under construction. On land, the PLA rocket force is the muscle behind the doctrine. Ballistic missiles like the DF-21D and the DF-26, some nicknamed carrier killers, are designed to strike US naval assets before they get close to the Taiwan Strait. Hypersonic glide vehicles like the DF-17 can evade missile shields entirely. This isn't posturing. This is deconstruction of deterrence. Xi is building a military designed not just to defend China's shores, but to cross oceans, control straits, and challenge the post-World War II maritime order. But it's not just about capability. It's about narrative control. In 2024, the phrase peaceful reunification, as previously mentioned, all but vanished from Chinese state media. Xi no longer talks like a man trying to win hearts and minds. He talks like a man preparing the people for sacrifice, for struggle, and, as he says, for inevitability. As we said, the mid-2020s are remarkably dangerous, but why? This window that we're entering, the United States distracted with an election, with a polarized Congress, ongoing commitments in Ukraine and Israel, and possibly an aggravation of Iran. You think Washington has the bandwidth for another war? Well, apparently the Chinese do not. Then we have the West, which is fragmented. The EU is focused inward with its problems, and NATO is far overstretched. And the Pacific, well, is still building muscle memory for conflict. Taiwan itself is divided, with Lai Ching-te holding the presidency but not the legislature. Public will is strong, true, but the readiness is brutal. And meanwhile, the Chinese military is testing every scenario, from live-fire drills simulating blockades to cyber war exercises targeting satellite and telecom systems, from amphibious landing training on the coast of Fujian to the ideological purification of its officer corps. Xi Jinping is not playing Go anymore, he's playing chess. And in chess, the goal isn't to invade the board, it's to trap the king before the other side even knows it's checkmate. For our second segment, we will discuss Taiwan's dilemma. Is Taiwan a fortress or a fantasy? We will discuss domestic politics, Lai Ching-te's presidency and the DPP's balancing act, military preparedness when it comes to civilian defense, asymmetric warfare and conscription, social and psychological readiness, and the question remains, are the Taiwanese ready for a sustained war? And the TSMC, the Silicon Shield, a deterrent or a target. Well, let's get into it, shall we? Every fortress looks indestructible, that much is known. That is until the first shell lands. Taiwan is a modern democracy. It's a tech powerhouse. It's a symbol of freedom, of resistance, of everything Beijing claims is an illusion. But the real question isn't whether Taiwan stands for something. It's whether Taiwan can stand at all. Let's start with the political reality. In January 2024, Lai Ching-te won the presidency under the Democratic Progressive Party banner, on a platform of peace through strength, mind you. But strength is hard to build when your parliament is fractured. Lai faces a hostile legislature dominated by the opposition Kuomintang, a party more open to dialogue with Beijing. This isn't just party politics. It's a fault line that cuts through Taiwan's strategic posture. Every major defense bill, now a negotiation. Every missile purchase, a political battle. And time is not on their side. So what's the plan? Well, Taiwan has embraced what analysts like to call a porcupine strategy, making itself so bristling, so painful to attack that even a dragon hesitates to bite. It sounds clever, but asymmetric warfare always does. But here's the hard truth. A porcupine still bleeds. In 2023, Taiwan reinstated mandatory conscription. Not a week, not 3 months, but a full year of service. The move was widely praised until the implementation exposed what everybody feared. A hollowed force, under-trained, under-resourced, and under-prepared for the war that they may be preparing for. Drills have increased. The Hangquang military exercises now simulate full-scale invasion after all. And they've begun training civilians for resistance, for shelter, for survival. But is it enough? The Ministry of Defense admits it still has manpower gaps. And even in uniform, many conscripts have no illusions. Some call themselves cannon fodder. Others simply don't believe war will ever come. And belief in war is half the battle. Taiwan's leadership is walking a tightrope between warning the people and not terrifying them, between preparing for a siege and avoiding panic. But let's be blunt. The average citizen still expects the Americans to show up before the bombs fall. That's not a strategy, that's a matter of faith. So what's left? The TSMC. Or a name that you should memorize because it stands for the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the most advanced chip maker on Earth. 90% of the world's leading edge semiconductors come from its fabs. Chips that run your phone, chips that guide US missiles, chips that power China's AI. This is what some call the Silicon Shield, the idea that Taiwan is too important to destroy outright, that no one would dare set the world's supply chain on fire. It's a comforting theory, but comforting theories don't stop missiles. Let me ask you this. If you had Beijing and you knew that the world runs on chips made on an island you want to conquer, do you leave those fabs untouched? Or do you seize them first? Do you cripple them? Do you use them as leverage? Do you hold a gun at the head of the world economy? Here's the uncomfortable truth. TSMC isn't just a target. It's the target, not a deterrent. And Taiwan knows it. They've built kill switches into their production systems. They've worked with the United States to decentralize parts of the supply chain. But no matter what they do, the core infrastructure is still there. And it's still exposed. And if war breaks out, those clean rooms could become smoking ruins in hours. So, where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with an uncomfortable truth. And this uncomfortable truth is what people call the Taiwan dilemma. We need to think about the world economy. But first, we need to take into account that the Taiwan dilemma is one of the most important geopolitical questions of the century. First, we have domestic politics, or President Lai's mandate. Taiwan's new president, Lai Ching-te of the DPP, has pledged peace but also vigilance. On his first anniversary in office, he repeated calls for dialogue with Beijing on the basis of democracy, but insisted Taiwan must continue to strengthen their defenses. Lai's Democratic Progressive Party won the presidency in 2024, but the Kuomintang and allies control the legislature. This split forces Lai to balance pro-defense policies with the need for broad political consensus. The opposition KMT argues for more engagement with China as a way to reduce tensions, while Lai's DPP often frames China as the threat. Taiwan's political divide, or the cross-strait relations versus Taiwanese sovereignty, remains a complicating factor for its strategy. Then we have military preparedness. We have the asymmetrical equation and the civilians. Taiwan has been overhauling its defense posture towards an asymmetric porcupine strategy. It recently extended conscription to 1 year and is training large reserve units. However, challenges persist. The Ministry of Defense, as we previously mentioned, admitted it's behind on training for the new conscripts and reported recruitment shortfalls. And they also reported they have already shrunk total personnel from 165,000 in 2022 to 133,000 by 2024. In parallel, Taiwan is emphasizing a whole-of-society defense. Recent Han Kuang War Games for 2025 integrated civilian resilience exercises, training citizens in emergency response, securing infrastructure, and stockpiling supplies. Military and civilian drills now assume any conflict will be protracted and use both kinetic and non-kinetic means. Nevertheless, concerns remain about morale and readiness. Last year's conscripts, suicides, and complaints about being cannon fodder highlighted a social strain. Taiwan's leaders are racing to fix these gaps, but time is short to prepare. And the public, along with the forces, are clearly not ready for a real fight. We have the social readiness factor. Public opinion in Taiwan is mixed. Many citizens strongly support democracy and resist Beijing's claim, but few of them crave war. Most Taiwanese want peace and stability. Surveys show limited enthusiasm for armed conflict. Nonetheless, the government is trying to instill a keener sense of alertness after Hong Kong's fate and recent threats. Officials have launched information campaigns and drills. For example, they have the rehearsing war exercises in Taipei to raise readiness and awareness. The effectiveness of this campaign is uncertain at best. Some analysts warn that decades of peace make it hard to quickly convert the nation to wartime footing. The truth is, if war came, the average people would face drastic upheavals, be they blackouts, shortages, or civilian mobilization breaking up families. And this would arrive with little to no warning. This psychological factor, how determined the Taiwanese public is, would be just as important as the hardware they would use. Then we have the TSMC, as we called it, the Silicon Shield of Taiwan. But we argue that it's more of a target. What we need to take into account is, as we previously mentioned, that Taiwan's semiconductor industry produces 90% of the world's leading-edge chip production. These are critical to global tech and supposedly deter a Chinese attack. While the chip industry certainly raises the economic stakes, experts caution it is not a guaranteed shield. A CFR analyst notes that Taiwan's chip dominance acts as a brake by making any conflict extremely costly, but ultimately is unlikely to act as a silicon shield if Beijing decides it must unify Taiwan. In fact, TSMC fabs almost certainly become high-value targets. Disabling them would cripple both Taiwan's economy and the global tech supply. So, we have Taiwan arming, training and mobilizing. But beneath the surface lies a brutal question. Can a free, open society truly prepare for annihilation? They're trying, they're buying time, and their movements are admirable. But buying time only matters if someone's coming to save you. In our next segment, titled The Invasion Playbook, we'll walk you through how China could strike, blockade, blitz, or bleed out Taiwan slowly, and whether the US and its allies are ready to stop it. First, we have a number of options. But as we know, the first casualty of any war is the battle plan. Let's stop pretending this is theoretical. China has a playbook, but while the exact script remains hidden in the PLA's war rooms, we've seen enough exercises, enough white papers, and enough leaked assessments to know what's on the table. There are three broad options, each one ugly, each one real. First, we have the Hollywood scenario, the big one, a full-scale amphibious invasion. Massive fleets, beaches turned to fire, and the red flag flying over Taipei. It's also the most dangerous option, for Beijing included. A full-scale amphibious invasion means launching tens of thousands of troops across 180 kilometers of contested water. It means weather delays, American satellites watching every ship, and Taiwan firing every missile it has. Taiwan's geography isn't friendly either. The west coast is narrow, it has few beaches, and choke points everywhere. It's a D-Day on steroids, plus drones, hypersonics, and orbital surveillance. But here's the kicker. China has been training for this. They've built land ships, they've built hovercrafts and massive amphibious assault vessels. They've rehearsed in Fujian province, just across the strait, with simulated beach landings. They know this would cost them dearly. But the real danger isn't the landing. It's what happens after. Even if the PLA makes it ashore, they'd face urban warfare, sabotage, guerrilla resistance, and a televised bloodbath. So, would they really do it? Maybe, but not first. As we said, analysts outline several possible Chinese approaches. You have the full-scale amphibious landing, storming Taiwan's beaches with massive troop convoys. This would be extremely complex and high risk. It would require neutralizing Taiwan's anti-ship missiles and air defenses and managing a difficult geography. China has been building the means, be they landing ships, hovercraft type 070 and 076 assault carriers, but experts warn such a landing would still face stiff resistance. A second option is a decapitation strike doubled by a blockade. China could first launch massive missiles or airstrikes to destroy Taiwanese command and control and missile batteries, then fly in airborne troops or special forces to seize key points. Meanwhile, the PLA Navy and Coast Guard could impose a tight sea and air blockade around Taiwan. Think tanks note this hybrid mode, made out of swift blows without immediately landing heavy forces, is plausible. A third option is a prolonged naval and air blockade coupled with grey zone tactics. China could deploy cutters and maritime militia to harass shipping. They could cut undersea cables, jam communications and conduct information warfare, be it propaganda or cyber attack. They would do so to weaken Taiwan without a full invasion. Such a blockade, similar to what occurred in Libya's civil war or around Ukraine, could isolate Taiwan economically while avoiding an all-out war. Any of these scenarios could be combined or sequenced. For example, a blockade first, followed by an attempted landing if Taiwan shows weakness. But how the US and its allies respond at this unprecedented land invasion? Would they stand idly by and watch 90% of the world's semiconductors under Chinese influence? Well, the US strategy is to hold the first island chain. Taiwan lies at a choke point of key shipping routes, so Washington and allies, such as Japan, South Korea, Australia and the Philippines, are planning to contest any Chinese gains there. In practice, this means joint naval exercises and deployments through Japan and the Philippines. The so-called Island Chain Defense Doctrine. After all, we have Washington's most recent AUKUS Pact with Britain and with Australia. They will put nuclear submarines in Australian waters in order to deter China. Japan, as well, is dramatically rearming. Its government plans to roughly double defense spending to buy new long-range missiles to strike enemy ships at a distance. Meanwhile, the Philippines, who are a mutual defense treaty ally, has reopened US military bases on Clark and on Subic, and host annual Balikatan drills, signaling Manila is ready to let US forces operate there if needed. In cyber and space, a major conflict would involve Chinese attacks on Taiwan's communication. Experts warn of satellite spoofing or jamming and cutting undersea cables. Efforts to blind civilian infrastructure and disable 5G networks would also be in full effect. Washington and Taipei are preparing countermeasures, for example emergency satellite communications or alternate routing, but acknowledge this invisible front would be hotly contested. So a number of questions arise. How far will Washington go? How much destruction can Tokyo absorb if it's called to do so? How long before Manila, Canberra or Seoul blink? And if no one moves fast enough, how will the world react to Taiwan's fall? Will the world stand idly by watching a democracy die in 4K? Coming up next, we have the global shockwaves, the markets, the alliances and the tech apocalypse. You thought war was bad? Well, wait until you see what it does to the world economy. Let's get started. Well, first of all, the war in Taiwan would translate as a semiconductor Armageddon, because 90% of the advanced chips on the entire globe come from Taiwan. Then we would have a financial panic. Blockade or invasion would shatter markets either way. We would have sanctions, we would have a war economy and energy rerouting. There are many other things to discuss. We would have to discuss the risk of a second Ukraine effect, where Europe's position, Ocean's silence and India's ambiguity being main contention points. After all, when a bomb drops in Taipei, the tremors are felt in Frankfurt. When a strait closes in East Asia, factories shut down in Michigan. And when the lights go out at TSMC, the world goes dark. Let me be clear. A war over Taiwan is not a regional crisis. It's a global system shock. The geopolitical equivalent of pulling the plug on the world economy. Let's start with the obvious. Well, the semiconductor catastrophe. Taiwan produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors, as I've already said 30 times in this video. But that's not just your smartphone, that's everything. Weapons, satellites, cars, servers, whatever you can think of. It's probably got a Taiwanese chip in it. You name it. If it's smart, it runs on Taiwanese silicon. TSMC alone, as I said, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company produces chips at nanometer scales no one else on Earth can replicate at scale. It's let's consider that if even one fab goes offline, the entire global supply chain collapses. If all of Taiwan is disrupted, we're not talking shortages, we're talking tech winter. Phones disappear, factories idle, fighter jets get grounded. AI? Forget about it, it's paused. Data centers are strangled. Missile production delayed. TSMC isn't just about business, it's infrastructure. It's a geopolitical choke point with circuits. Now imagine a missile strike near, let's say, Hsinchu. Imagine a blockade preventing chemical precursors from arriving, or worse, imagine Beijing seizing these fabs and holding a literal gun at the head of the world economy. You thought OPEC had leverage? Well, this is OPEC with ones and with zeros. The markets would collapse. The moment shots are fired in the Taiwan Strait, markets would immediately go into a panic and crash. Not slide, crash. The Nikkei would plunge. The Dow would halt its trading. German industrial nosedives. Shipping insurance premiums exploding. The strait is a superhighway for East Asian trade. Over 600 billion worth of goods pass through these waters every year. Block the strait and you strangle Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, the Philippines, and yes, China as well. China imports, after all, most of its energy through sea lanes that run right past Taiwan, which means Beijing would be launching a war that also threatens its own lifeline. This isn't just risky. It's an existential poker, and the whole table burns if one player flips it. Commodity prices, well, they would go nuclear. Oil spikes, rare earths evaporating. The global supply chains unraveling not in months but in mere days. And we haven't even mentioned sanctions. Well, let's talk about the ghost of Russia's war. Think back to 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine, the West sanctioned everything. Banks, gas, trade planes, yachts, even the SWIFT money transfer channel. And it still didn't stop Vladimir Putin, not a bit. Now apply that model to China, a country 10 times more economically entangled. Sanction China and you also sanction your own economy. US firms frozen. European exports blocked. Developing countries cut off from cheap tech and vaccines. The economic boomerang would be staggering. And yet, doing nothing would be worse. The West cannot afford to lose Taiwan and pretend business continues as usual. Which means massive sanctions are likely to go into effect the moment something happens in the Strait of Taiwan. Now, you need to realize this means that we're starting down a new global trade war with the world's second largest economy. Russia's invasion gave up High gas prices, yes, but a Taiwan war? It gives us stagflation on steroids. Not a cost of living crisis, a cost of functioning collapse. So where does everybody else land? Well, the G7 has already issued statements. The peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait is indispensable. Strong words. But words don't really break a blockade if you think about it. Europe is split. France talks autonomy, Germany is financially dependent. Eastern Europe leans Atlantic, but no one's ready for a tech apocalypse. Ocean, well, they're hedging. They want calm seas and cheap trade. They won't pick sides unless they're forced. India, a silent giant. Publicly neutral, but privately deeply alarmed. A war in the Taiwan Strait cuts into India's growth, chips and ambitions alike. They won't fight, but they'll definitely exploit the chaos. Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, most don't care about the Taiwanese issue itself, but they will care about its ripple effects. They will care about rising debt, collapsing commodity prices, Western distraction, and Chinese pressure. A war in Asia becomes a cascade of instability worldwide. What starts in Taipei doesn't stay in Taipei. It travels through ports, networks, currencies, and hearts alike. Let's go into detail about this semiconductor Armageddon. Taiwan is the linchpin of the global chip industry. Think about what would mean for everybody to have 90% of the world's cutting-edge microchips, which are currently made by TSMC, gone. A conflict instantly threatens this supply. Even a short blockade or intimidation of straight traffic would paralyze chip production and hold electronics manufacturing worldwide. Analysts estimate that trillions of dollars of global GDP could be wiped out by cutting Taiwan's chip output. This means every smartphone, server, and advanced weapon system would suffer shortages. Simply put, any Chinese move on Taiwan risks a silicon apocalypse. Higher costs, empty store shelves, and an immediate hit to US companies such as Apple or Nvidia. These companies depend, after all, on the Taiwanese foundries making the microchips. Then we have the market and energy panic. The Taiwan Strait is also a major shipping lane, after all. Taiwanese ports handled roughly $600 billion in trade in 2022. A conflict or a blockade would force global rerouting. Ships might avoid Asia-Pacific entirely. Sharply rising insurance costs, as we previously discussed in other episodes about how insurance costs affect global shipping. For example, much of Japan's and South Korea's oil and raw materials pass through these waters, so disruption could drive energy prices up, just as the Houthi attacks did on the Red Sea. Then we have the global market, which would likely go into a freefall on news of a blockade or invasion. Stock and commodity markets would crash as uncertainty spikes. Sanctions would further jolt economies. Russia's example shows that cutting China off, which buys over half of all solar panels and deep trade with the West, would trigger colossal trade wars. Meanwhile, countries would scramble to secure alternative energy. China itself would lose much of the Middle East oil reserves. In short, supply shocks and war economics. That means wartime production and shortages alike. These would quickly follow, potentially throwing the global economy into a recession, or even worse. Then we have the aforementioned geopolitical ripple effect, or the second Ukraine. How would the rest of the world respond? Some Western democracies have already signaled solidarity. The 2024 G7 communiqué explicitly pledged that peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is indispensable. But the reaction in practice could be mixed. Europe is still recovering from the Ukraine. and might provide political support and heavy sanctions on China as it did on Russia previously, but Asia-Pacific alliances would be tested more directly. ASEAN countries such as Vietnam, Malaysia and Indonesia are largely hedging. Most would quietly brace for fallout, reluctant to anger Beijing. India would face a dilemma. It has no formal ties to Taiwan whatsoever, but it has some deep economic links. Analysts note that India is highly unlikely to fight. Yet, a cross-strait war would still severely hurt India's economy. A Bloomberg estimate puts global costs at more than 10% of the GDP of the entire planet. Consequentially, India's government is publicly non-committal, likely hoping that the US shoulders the burden. In short, the second Ukraine effect might mean loud sanctions and aid in the West, muted statements in ASEAN, and more open strategic alignment, such as India and Japan and Australia bolstering their ties with the United States. And now the big question: what happens to the world order? In 1945, the United States became the anchor of global stability. Its power held open the seas. Its dollar underpinned trade. Its alliances guaranteed peace. But if Taiwan falls, if the US hesitates or fails, the credibility vanishes. Not in theory, but in real time. Now, in our next segment, we will discuss containment or collapse, or the strategic calculations from Washington to Tokyo. Well, let's get started. Guam is hardened. Japan is armed. The Philippines, after years of drifting towards China, are back in the game, reopening bases to US forces in Subic and in Clark. War games like the 2024 and 2025 Vigilant Shield and Balikatan have rehearsed full-scale Chinese invasion scenarios. The Marines have even rebuilt themselves around island hopping and anti-ship warfare. This isn't nostalgia. It's a new version of Guadalcanal, but with drones, satellites and hypersonic missiles. But here's the dark reality. Even in the most optimistic US simulation, Taiwan still burns. One Rand Corporation war game saw US and Taiwanese forces lose over 50% of their aircraft in the first 72 hours. Carrier groups would get hit, satellites would go blind, and communications would collapse. It's not that America can't fight, it's that it has to decide how much it's willing to lose to stop China from occupying Taiwan. Sorry, force of habit. How fast are they willing to bleed in order to achieve that strategic goal? And talking strategy, we need to discuss strategic clarity versus strategic ambiguity. For decades, the US maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity, not saying if it would defend Taiwan, only that it would not tolerate an invasion. It was elegant, and it actually worked. Well, until it didn't, because now China is calling that bluff. In 2022, President Biden said on camera that the US would defend Taiwan 4 times. 4 times he repeated it. Each time the White House walked it back. But let's be honest, the genie's now out of the bottle. Ambiguity doesn't work anymore, especially when both sides think you're bluffing. In Congress, new resolutions push for a full strategic clarity. Binding agreements, weapons, stockpiles, and pre-positioned forces. But that shift brings itself a new risk. Clarity creates red lines, and red lines tend to get tested. What about the allies? Well, you have Japan, who is the linchpin of the Pacific. For the first time since the Second World War, Japan is rearming, and is doing so at speed. It's doubling its defense budget, buying US Tomahawks, building hypersonics of its own, and rewriting the meaning of Article 9. Privately, Japanese officials know if Taiwan falls, Okinawa would be next. They're not bystanders. They are in the blast radius of this future conflict. Then you have Australia. The AUKUS changed everything. Canberra is on the course to deploy nuclear-powered submarines in the 2030s. But for now, it's a signal and it's a pledge. It's also a warning. Australia knows its survival depends on keeping China in check before it arrives at Darwin's doorstep. The Philippines, well, they're the most precarious link in the entire defense chain. After years under Duterte, Manila is back in America's camp. But the clock is ticking. Base access is granted, drills are underway, but trust is fragile, and any American hesitation will fracture it again. Now ask yourself, what if the US doesn't intervene? What if Congress stalls? What if the president hesitates? What if the public, tired of wars in deserts and mountains, decide this island just isn't worth it? The consequences won't be contained. Let's get deeper into the picture. First, the US and allies preparing. The US Indo-Pacific Command has already pivoted for Taiwan scenarios. Forces are training in multi-domain littoral warfare. Army, Marine and Air Force units are practicing long-range strikes against enemy ships and rapid island defense strategies. This new doctrine emphasizes dispersal, keeping air and sea forces distributed so China's missile salvo can't wipe them out in one blow. Frequent war games, for example Vigilant Shield, which was an exercise held with Japan, Philippines and Australia, are rehearsing responses for blockade breaking to defending the first island chain. In Washington, policymakers increasingly voice strategic clarity. Congress has seen bills, for example, we have the H-Con Res number 8, urging the president to abandon the One China policy and treat Taiwan as a partner, reflecting a shift from past ambiguity. Japan, too, is hardening its stance. Beyond budget hikes, it has debated amending its constitution to allow collective self-defense, and it is also planning joint command centers with the US, with Australia, and most likely with any other war-fighting capable nation which would help them stand against the Chinese. And now, let us discuss the nightmare scenario. What if the US doesn't intervene? Well, most analysts agree that the US military would try to respond to a Chinese attack on Taiwan. A Chinese conquest without American force would shatter US credibility. As one expert puts it, if Taiwan fell to a blockade or invasion, it would undermine America's stability to defend Japan and the Philippines and shatter the credibility of its commitments in Asia. In a worst case, well, as I said, if the US stayed out, Taiwan would very likely fall quickly under Chinese power given the PLA's superiority. The consequences would be profound. The unthinkable, a Chinese victory, would have dreadful implications for the West. A successful Chinese takeover of Taiwan would have catastrophic knock-on effects. The Philippines, which are the next island chain country south of Taiwan, would suddenly face a northern neighbor that has just proven it can seize an ally by force. Filipino leaders would likely seek new security guarantees, but some fear Manila might be forced into an uneasy accommodation with Beijing given the geographical vicissitudes. Japan would be tremendously alarmed, and that could mean a number of things. The Pacific Forum once reported that Tokyo could be expected to go nuclear and rearm heavily if the US guarantees were seen as failing. A Chinese victory would also send shockwaves through NATO allies. Europe might either band together for a common defense or conversely fracture under Chinese-Russian influence campaigns. Global fate in the United States security umbrella would plummet. In the world of analysts, the fall of Taiwan could end the post-1945 liberal order, ushering into a new authoritarian world order where might makes right. The unthinkable option of Chinese victory, if China conquers Taiwan, whether by war or surrender, would mean the world has changed irrevocably. Not in theory, but in structure. The Philippines will pivot fast. It may cut deals with Beijing. It may deny access to US forces because no one wants to be the next Taiwan. Japan will panic, and in the panic that ensues, it may go nuclear, and it may cast off its post-war chains and build a war machine worthy of the threat. South Korea will watch closely. So will Vietnam, Indonesia, and India. But the real collapse is psychological. If Taiwan falls, and the US does nothing, then the myth of the American security umbrella dies. And once the myth dies, it doesn't come back. Every autocracy, from Moscow to Tehran to Pyongyang, will understand that the age of consequences is over. And liberal democracy, well, it will still exist. But it will no longer rule the seas. Because in international politics, credibility is currency. And if the US doesn't pay for Taiwan, it won't be able to afford anything else. Well, after yet another depressing episode, we go to everybody's favorite segment, the big picture. Let's pull back the lens and ask the final question. Is Taiwan the last line, or is it just the first domino? Now, let's go into it. The strait is the stage, and the world is the audience. Taiwan is not just a geopolitical flashpoint. It is a referendum on whether liberal democracies still have the will to resist authoritarian expansion. If it falls, a message echoes across the Pacific and the globe. Power, not principle, rules the 21st century. Taiwan is equal to the symbol of the free world's credibility. Lessons from Ukraine, Afghanistan, and Hong Kong are one of the main contention points. We will also provide you in this segment with 3 scenarios, 3 potential realpolitik forecasts, called containment, hybrid quarantine, or open conflict. Now, history doesn't really ask if you're ready. It just keeps the receipts. So far we've dissected China's playbook. We've measured Taiwan's defenses, and we've traced the shockwaves of a war that hasn't started, well, at least not yet. Now comes the part that matters most, the response. Because when the missiles fly and the cables snap, the markets also shatter, and the world will look to one capital above all others. And that capital is Washington, D.C. Let's ask the question no one wants to answer out loud. Will the United States of America fight for Taiwan? Well, let's start with what we know so far. First, we have the US military posture. Is it readiness or is it rhetoric? Well, one thing I can tell you, the Indo-Pacific Command is not asleep. US strategy rests on holding the first island chain, a string of allied positions stretching from Japan through Taiwan, the Philippines, all the way to Borneo. Now, somewhere between the fear of escalation and the paralysis of diplomacy lies a narrow, trembling space called consequence. Taiwan lives in that space, and the world may die in it. Let me speak as plainly as I can. The Taiwan crisis is not just a regional flashpoint. It's not just a question of reunification or sovereignty or even of semiconductor flows. It's a question of what kind of world comes next. There are wars that redraw borders, there are wars that realign alliances, and then there are wars that reset the architecture of civilization. I'm afraid that the war over Taiwan is the third kind of war. And make no mistake, we're closer to it now than at any point in the past 70 years. Let's rewind the tape for a bit. When the Berlin Wall fell, when the Soviet Union collapsed, when American warships patrolled every ocean uncontested, there was a sense, maybe foolish, maybe premature, that history has been resolved. Just ask Francis Fukuyama. In other words, we all had the sense that freedom had won. But freedom is not self-sustaining. It requires maintenance like any other thing. And it also requires vigilance. And yes, sometimes it requires sacrifice. Taiwan is not just a piece of land, it's the front line of a much bigger idea. The idea that democracies deserve to exist even within the reach of empires. That small nations don't have to kneel. That principles, not just power, still matter. If China takes Taiwan by force, and the world does not stop it, the lesson will be heard in every capital from Warsaw to Warsaw. And liberalism is fragile these days. Alliances would seem optional, and the future would seem to belong to those who seize it, not those who vote for it. And let's not delude ourselves, there is no safe corner of the world in that scenario, because what happens in the Taiwan Strait doesn't stay in the Taiwan Strait. It reverberates all the way through the South China Sea, where freedom of navigation dies one blockade at a time, or the Arctic, where Russia watches and learns, or the Persian Gulf, where Iran recalculates its red lines, or the halls of Brussels, where the European project begins to rot from cowardice, and Washington, where the American Republic must ask itself if it still has the spine to lead, or if it has chosen to age into irrelevance while streaming Netflix and doom-scrolling itself into entropy and collapse. I'm afraid there is no opt-out button for this crisis. Not for Romania, not for Poland, not for the Philippines, and certainly not for the United States. This is a referendum on everything the post-World War II world order has stood for, and it's being held in the waters east of Kinmen Island. So where do we go from here? Well, as I said, we offer you 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, we have called containment. Taiwan is more than a local dispute, and in a cold containment scenario, Taiwan remains independent, but isolated by sanctions and political isolation. Grey war short of full invasion would be the norm, creating a tense stalemate. Then we have the hybrid quarantine scenario, where China imposes a blockade or limited occupation, and Taiwan survives only as a heavily fortified rump with a global economic retaliation on its wake. Both sides war economically without a full-scale fight. Then we have the nightmare of open conflict. A large-scale war ensues, throwing the US and its allies into combat with massive destruction in Asia and potentially beyond. None of these outcomes are pleasant. The real message is the world need not choose between unconditional surrender and war, but it must prepare for both. For democracy to prevail, Taipei will need all the help it can get, be it diplomatic, military or economic, and Beijing must know that the price of aggression would be crippling. As one strategist warns, if Taiwan falls, a message will echo across the Pacific and the globe. Power, not principle, rules the 21st century. The question for the next months and years is whether democratic powers have the resolve to write a different ending to this drama. Now, what does the first scenario, the cold containment one, look like? Well, in short, it means no invasion, no missiles, just pressure. China surrounds Taiwan economically, diplomatically and digitally. They do sabotage, they put sanctions and cyber warfare into the field. The US continues arms shipments, Japan hosts more US forces, Beijing screams but doesn't fire. And for a few more years we play Cold War 2.0 with better marketing. But this is a slow bleed. Taiwan grows isolated, China builds legitimacy block by block, and eventually the island may surrender without a shot. Then we have scenario 2, hybrid quarantine. This is the Grey War. Beijing imposes a blockade, a defensive quarantine they would call it. Airlines reroute, cargo ships disappear, and the PLA seizes the outlying islands, Kinmen and Matsu. The US sanctions, Taiwan mobilizes, but nobody commits fully. Markets crash, allies argue, diplomacy stalls. China wears the world down, not through shock but through endurance. 1 year, 2, until the idea of Taiwanese independence becomes a mere memory. Then we have the firestorm, scenario 3, open conflict. Missiles raining on Taipei, the US responding, Japan invoking collective self-defense, and the Philippines becoming a battlefield. Carriers burning, satellites falling, the world splitting into two. A new Iron Curtain descending, but this time a digital one, an economic one, and a technological one. And if we survive it, we won't be in the world we know anymore. We'll be in a world rebuilt from the ashes of deterrence. This has been Realpolitik Confidential Episode 9. The Two Chinas, Reunification, Invasion, or called Containment. I have been your host, Alex Crișan, and in a world where ideology clouds judgment and comfort blinds vision, we bring you what still matters. Less ideology, more analysis. Now, I want to thank everybody who's listened so far to our episodes. We're approaching episode 10, and we have learned along the way how to do this increasingly better, or at least we hope. I want to thank everybody from the bottom of my heart, and God bless you all. See you soon, here on YouTube, and to my closer watchers on Instagram. Goodbye.